The city streets of medieval Europe never truly slept. Beneath the looming cathedrals and crumbling stone walls, markets bustled by day, and taverns whispered with secrets by night. Merchants, pilgrims, thieves, and soldiers filled the narrow lanes, where the torchlight painted shadows against crooked timbered houses. And among these restless streets walked women whose very existence challenged the order of their world, prostitutes, both tolerated and despised. Medieval rulers, bishops, and guild masters argued endlessly over these women. Were they a necessary evil, a lesser sin to protect respectable wives from temptation? Or were they dangerous outcasts, polluting Christian cities with scandal and shame? This tension shaped a strange, double-edged reality. Brothels might be licensed by city councils on one street, while only a few alleys away, the same women could be dragged to a public square for punishment. To understand how they were treated, we need to step into the crowded heart of a medieval city, where morality, fear, and power collided. In cities like London, Paris, Cologne, and Florence, prostitution was often an open secret. Authorities taxed brothels, regulated where they could stand, and even required prostitutes to wear distinctive clothing. In some towns, a woman working in the trade had to wear striped hoods or yellow sleeves so everyone knew who she was. It was a branding in cloth, a moving signal of dishonor. But this uneasy tolerance could vanish overnight. Whenever plague struck, famine loomed, or a moral panic spread, prostitutes became the first scapegoats. City councils or church courts ordered public punishments to cleanse the streets. These were not hidden acts. They were staged spectacles meant to terrify and to teach. Imagine a cold morning in the marketplace. The bells of the town hall summon citizens to gather. Merchants abandon their stalls, and children climb onto barrels for a better view. At the center stands a wooden pillory, rough beams waiting to clamp shut on a trembling neck and wrists. A woman accused of unchaste living is led forward by the watchman. Her clothes are torn, her hair unbound, a sign of disgrace. The crowd shouts. Some jeer, others spit, a few turn away. But the officials make sure everyone witnesses what comes next. She may be locked in the pillory for hours, forced to endure insults, rotten food hurled in her face, or icy water poured over her head. In harsher cities, she might be whipped as she walked through the streets, her crime proclaimed by the beat of a drum. Such punishments were not merely about law and order. They were theater, a grim moral performance. Prostitutes were used as living warnings. See what happens if you defy God's order. See how shame burns hotter than any brand. In Florence during the 14th century, civic officials forced convicted prostitutes to parade barefoot through the streets, wearing only a thin shift, carrying candles as a sign of penance. They were marched past the very churches whose bells had tolled for their humiliation. In Paris, records show women whipped through the streets or banished entirely, their possessions seized to fund the punishment. In London, Southwark's brothels operated under royal license, but that did not protect the women inside. Court rolls from the 1300s record prostitutes dragged before aldermen, fined, or made to stand at the pillory at Cheapside, one of the busiest markets in England. Punishment was a public spectacle because public memory was the real sentence. A fine could be forgotten. A face shamed in the square could not. Why such harsh treatment? Partly it was fear. The church taught that sexual sin could bring God's wrath on the whole city. Plague, fire, or famine as divine punishment. Women in prostitution became visible symbols of vice, blamed whenever disaster struck. But there was also control. In many medieval towns, men who governed markets, guilds, and courts used these punishments to assert their moral authority. By publicly humiliating prostitutes, they showed they could control female behavior and reinforce the social order. These punishments sent a message to wives, daughters, and servants as much as to the women themselves. Some penalties were bizarre, even theatrical. In certain German towns, prostitutes who violated curfew were forced to ride backward on donkeys through the marketplace, holding the tail instead of the reins, while the crowd howled with laughter. In Italian cities, some women had their hair cut off, a visible and painful stripping of pride. A woman's hair was considered her glory, and to shear it off was to erase her dignity in front of everyone. Records from Lübeck in the 15th century show officials dunking prostitutes in rivers, not to kill them, but to terrify them. The punishment, called ducking, left the victim coughing, freezing, and soaked as a warning to others. In some towns, prostitutes who offended repeatedly were branded on the forehead or cheek, a permanent mark that told the world what they were. Even when not punished physically, the rules themselves carried humiliation. In some places, prostitutes were forbidden to wear expensive belts, veils, or shoes. They could not enter certain churches, or had to sit in separate pews. Their very bodies became regulated spaces, patrolled by laws written to keep them visible and degraded. Yet, despite all these punishments, prostitution never disappeared. The demand remained constant, and so did the hypocrisy of the officials who punished women by day and visited them by night. Chronicles and court records are full of contradictions. Bishops denouncing brothels while quietly protecting favored ones, mayors issuing edicts against lewd women, while collecting taxes from the same trade. Some women resisted. A few even sued city officials for wrongful punishment, claiming they were falsely accused or unfairly fined. Others fled from one town to another, seeking cities with laxer rules. But for many, poverty left no choice. When harvests failed or husbands died, selling one's body became the only way to survive, and that survival often led straight to the pillory. The language of medieval ordinances reveals something deeper. Prostitutes were not just punished for what they did, but for what they represented, a breach in the fragile moral wall of Christian society. They were symbols of female independence, moving through the streets at night without male protection, earning money outside patriarchal control. Punishing them was not only about sin, but about power. Even popular entertainment reflected this. Medieval poems and plays mocked prostitutes as greedy or deceitful, reinforcing the idea that they deserved their fate. When an actual woman was punished in public, the performance matched the fiction. Crowds treated it like theater, laughing, throwing refuse, chanting insults. The line between law and spectacle blurred completely. Not all punishments were brutal. Some were purely ritual, meant to shame rather than harm. In certain towns, a prostitute might be forced to kneel at the church door on Sunday, holding a candle as parishioners filed past. Others were required to pay for a mass for their own souls, a strange punishment that mixed piety and irony. But even these milder penalties carried a heavy social cost. Reputation was everything in a medieval city. Once marked as dishonored, a woman could lose work, friends, and even the right to marry. Despite all of this, some cities openly managed prostitution as a necessary service. In Augsburg and Nuremberg, municipal brothels were supervised by officials who enforced rules but also provided protection. Women there had to submit to inspections and pay fees, but they were technically shielded from arbitrary arrest, unless they broke curfew or tried to work outside the licensed district. The paradox was complete. The same government that punished prostitutes also profited from them. As the late Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance, attitudes began to harden. With the spread of new diseases like syphilis and the rise of stricter moral codes, punishments became even more severe. In Spain and Italy, some cities expelled all prostitutes entirely, whipping those who returned. In Northern Europe, Reformation leaders called for harsher crackdowns, treating prostitution as an offense against God and community rather than a tolerated evil. Through it all, the image of the punished prostitute haunted medieval memory. A woman standing in the cold, her hair shorn, her cheeks red from shame and frost, surrounded by a crowd whose laughter masked their fear. Fear of sin, fear of disorder, fear of women who could not be controlled. Across the patchwork of medieval Europe, punishment for prostitution varied not only by city but by who held power at any given moment. Bishops, dukes, town councils, or guild leaders might all claim authority over urban morality. In some cities, regulation turned into outright persecution. Brothels that had once been tolerated or even taxed were suddenly raided, their doors smashed, and the women dragged out into the streets as symbols of civic disgrace. The punishments were designed not to kill but to mark, to warn, to control. Public humiliation was often more effective than imprisonment because it sent a message to everyone watching. A woman who walked through the marketplace in chains, wearing a tall conical hat or a wooden collar, was a living sermon about sin. The authorities wanted her to embody the warning, to make vice visible and shame contagious. In Paris, records from the 13th century show women forced to march barefoot through the streets, dressed in rags, with placards declaring their alleged crimes. Their hair, often considered a mark of feminine pride, might be shorn off entirely. Baldness made them instantly recognizable and hard to hide, a living scarlet letter. In German cities like Nuremberg and Augsburg, municipal brothels were heavily regulated, but any woman caught selling sex outside official walls faced harsher penalties. Some were locked in iron cages and dunked repeatedly into rivers or fountains before crowds of jeering townsfolk. These cucking stools and dunking devices were used for scolds and dishonest traders as well, but when applied to prostitutes, the ritual took on a sharper edge. The idea was that cold water would wash away sin, or at least drench the fear of sin into every onlooker. Elsewhere, women were paraded wearing distinctive shame masks, grotesque iron visors with exaggerated noses or leering mouths. These masks symbolized deceit, lust, and greed. Even if the punishment lasted only a day, its memory could stain a woman for life. Medieval people lived in tightly knit communities where everyone knew everyone's business. A single walk of shame could ruin her trade, her marriage prospects, and her standing forever. One of the most infamous punishments occurred in Florence, where prostitutes who broke curfews were stripped of their fine gowns and forced to wear yellow, a color linked with dishonor and disease. This yellow badge not only marked them but barred them from respectable inns, markets, and churches. The authorities were sending a clear message. They could exist, but only in the shadows under strict watch. Florence wasn't alone. Similar dress codes appeared in London, Lubeck, and Basel. In some places, women had to wear striped hoods, bells on their clothing, or special girdles that clanked as they walked, making anonymity impossible. Despite these brutal measures, prostitution did not vanish. Cities depended on it in ways they rarely admitted. Many urban leaders preferred to contain the trade rather than eradicate it, believing that male desire had to be channeled, lest it lead to worse crimes. So they built municipal brothels on the edges of town and hired madams to enforce order. But any woman who operated outside these licensed walls was treated as both criminal and corrupter. There was also a strong element of gendered control at work. Punishments aimed at women's bodies, appearance, and movement reinforced the notion that female sexuality was dangerous unless tightly confined. A man who visited a brothel might face a fine, but his reputation often survived unscathed. A woman accused of selling sex, however, risked being branded, sometimes literally. In parts of France, women caught repeatedly were marked with hot irons, leaving permanent scars. These punishments were not only civic theater. They were also a form of social policing. By humiliating a few, authorities sought to discipline many. A cobbler's daughter might think twice about accepting gifts from a stranger after seeing another girl dragged through the marketplace. A young widow struggling to pay her rent might reconsider becoming a courtesan after hearing bells on the clothing of women marked as unclean. Public shame was cheaper than a prison system, and it satisfied the crowd's appetite for moral spectacle. But there were cracks in the system. Some women used the very visibility of their punishment to gain notoriety. A few became infamous folk figures, bold, unrepentant, even admired by those who despised the hypocrisy of city elites. Stories survive of women laughing as they were paraded through the streets, mocking the guards, turning the punishment into performance. Their defiance unnerved officials who depended on fear to maintain order. If shame failed, the entire logic of the spectacle began to crumble. The late Middle Ages brought new pressures. As Europe faced plague, famine, and war, moral anxieties sharpened. Prostitutes were often scapegoated, accused of spreading disease or undermining divine favor. Cities such as Cologne and Vienna expelled entire brothel districts, forcing women onto the roads with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Some of these women were captured by roaming soldiers or bandits, their fates unrecorded. Others drifted to neighboring towns, only to face the same cycle of tolerance and persecution. Religious reformers also intensified the climate of fear. Preachers thundered from pulpits about lust corrupting Christian society. They denounced civic leaders for profiting from brothel taxes and demanded stricter punishment. In some regions, the cry for purification grew so loud that towns organized morality raids, sweeping through suspected districts at night with torches. Women were rounded up, fined, whipped, or driven into the countryside. Men who purchased sex rarely faced such consequences. The double standard was obvious but rarely questioned. Even so, not all cities followed the path of pure repression. Venice, ever pragmatic, treated prostitution as an inevitable urban trade. Rather than relying solely on humiliation, the Venetian government sought to control where women worked, what they wore, and how they interacted with clients. Prostitutes were even enlisted as spies, gathering information from visiting merchants and diplomats. In Venice, the same woman who might be forced to wear a yellow veil in one district could be invited to private parties in another. This tension between moral condemnation and practical tolerance defined the medieval approach. Punishments were harsh and spectacular, yet inconsistent. A woman might be dragged through mud one year and quietly allowed to return to business the next. It all depended on who was watching, who was preaching, and how frightened the authorities were of divine wrath or civic unrest. Over time, these public humiliations laid the groundwork for later systems of policing morality. The idea that female sexuality needed to be marked, contained, and displayed to the crowd did not vanish with the Middle Ages. Instead, it evolved into new forms: sumptuary laws, curfews, and eventually prisons designed for fallen women. The medieval city square, where jeering crowds watched a woman shaved bald or dunked into a cold river, foreshadowed later institutions that sought to reform rather than merely punish. Yet even in its own age, the spectacle of shame was not universally accepted. Some theologians argued that relentless humiliation pushed women deeper into sin rather than lifting them out. A few towns experimented with offering sanctuary to prostitutes who wished to leave the trade, providing them with dowries, marriage opportunities, or work in charitable houses. These programs were rare but suggest that medieval society was not entirely without compassion. Still, the dominant story remains one of power and control. The punishments were public because the fear had to be public. Each shaved head, each yellow hood, each dripping figure emerging from a dunking cage spoke to a broader anxiety: that female sexuality, ungoverned, threatened the fragile order of the medieval world. By turning women into warnings, city leaders reassured themselves that they held the keys to both civic peace and divine favor. Today, walking through the old streets of Europe, it is hard to imagine the scenes that once unfolded there. A peaceful plaza may have been a stage for tears and ridicule. A quiet fountain may once have been a place of forced immersion. The cobblestones carry echoes of footsteps, bare, cold, and unwilling, of women paraded not as individuals, but as symbols of a society's fear of itself. The medieval punishment of prostitutes was never simply about enforcing laws. It was about defining who belonged, who did not, and who had the power to decide. Even as the centuries rolled on and these spectacles faded, the shadows they cast remained. The instinct to control through public shame, to make examples rather than solve problems, has echoed across history. The Middle Ages may seem distant, but the lesson is uncomfortably close. When society fears disorder, it often turns its gaze first upon the powerless, and it does so in ways meant to be seen, remembered, and obeyed.